All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here to join us tonight. My name is Mitch Boersma. I am the Director of Operations here at the Catholic Information Center. I want to welcome all of you here tonight and welcome many of you back to the CIC, to the new CIC, after we've done our major renovation. I hope you guys enjoy the space. It's much more set up now for events and programming like this. Many of you have been concerned about the size of the bookstore. I assure you all of the things you actually bought are still there. And all of the books that had been sitting there for the last 20 years all found good homes in libraries and homes all around the area. But we're very lucky to have all of you back here tonight. Very glad to have this evening here with the Catholic University of America and the Institute for Human Ecology, the CIC, and the Catholic University of America have had a long, close relationship that has only been deepened with the Institute of Human Ecology. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel here tonight, and then they will take it away. Our moderator tonight is Joe Capizzi. Joe is the executive director of the IHE and a professor of moral theology at CUA. Andrea Picotti-Beyer is the director of the Conscious Project and a strategy consultant at IHE. Ed Condon is the co-founder of The Pillar and a media fellow at IHE, and Father Aquinas Gilbo is the chaplain of CUA and a media fellow at IHE, here to discuss Pope Benedict XVI, his life and legacy. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mitch. You could hear from his introductions that we like to collect talent at the Institute for Human Ecology. That's why we're so honored and pleased to have the three people to my right, your left, be a part of what we're up to at the Institute, which again is trying to bring the truths of the Catholic tradition into engagement with our culture and to enliven them and to form young men and women in that deep tradition of ours. And we do this in part through events like this. And as Mitch said, we've been a long and happy partner of the CICs. This is one of the best places in DC to come. I think many of you know that from your professional lives, just to be able to find a kind of peace and quiet here that they offer is really irreplaceable. So the way this is going to go is that I will just make a couple of personal comments about Pope Benedict, and then I will hand this off to the people to my right in order. They're seated in the order that they will speak. They'll make some opening comments, and then we really want to hear from questions from you and respond to your questions. I think this is a kind of unprecedented moment for all of us as a church. We lost somebody of unparalleled intellect and devotion to the good of our church. And as a community, of course, we grieve together, but we also, come together to celebrate the legacy that he has left behind. And I think this is a great opportunity, just to do a little bit of that together. It's a little bit of a somber note. Some of you may have seen the news that Cardinal Pell passed away unexpectedly earlier today? Earlier today. So do keep him in mind, of course, and in your prayers as we move forward. Andrea will bother me if I forget, which I've already forgotten, that you can find out more about the Institute for Human Ecology at ihe.catholic.edu. Not bad, right? That's great. Okay, thank you. Do look into us. We have a lot going on, and we always welcome any constructive feedback that you might want to offer. This is not like a Tourette's thing. I will repeat your questions when you ask questions or we go to the moderating thing. That's in part just for the audience that's streaming in so they can hear what you guys are asking. So don't be bothered by that. And again, do your best to make them genuine questions for us. We really have some wonderfully learned people in front of us today who can contribute what they know from their own perspectives. I'm a theologian. Right. And I'm just going to tell a tiny little story about Pope Benedict's, Cardinal Ratzinger's involvement in my own theological formation. I was a graduate student at Notre Dame University in the 90s. And the 90s, of course, was when Pope John Paul II was Pope. And he was, as we all know, a charismatic and important figure for the church, a kind of galvanizing figure. I studied moral theology at Notre Dame, and if you know Notre Dame or know of Notre Dame at that moment in Notre Dame's history, it wasn't the friendliest ground for people like me, but nonetheless, there were wonderfully capable scholars there, and I enjoyed studying with them. But a lot of what we read was presented as, well, look, this is where the mind of the theologians are right now. Most theologians see these issues from this perspective. And there were a couple of exceptions to this. Of course, one was the Pope, right? One was Pope John Paul II. He was an exception to this. Another sort of cadre of exceptions to sort of where the theological mind of the church was and where it was headed were the so-called New Natural Law thinkers, the Germain Grisets and John Finnis's and Robbie George's and so on. But that was just a way of seeing things that didn't particularly appeal to me. And then along came two voices from out of the blue, at least from their perspective. One was Father Servais Pinckaers, right? And Father Pinckaers, a Dominican of enormous stature. His works started getting translated into English, and they became increasingly sort of a counterweight to a certain sort of approach. But the other was Cardinal Ratzinger's. And Cardinal Ratzinger appealed to me particularly in part because we shared, I'm being immodest, right? I didn't share anything with Cardinal Ratzinger in terms of stature, right? But I too was moved, sorry, Father, more by the Augustinian approach, the Bonaventuran Augustinian approach, than I was by the Thomistic approach. You might say I've since course corrected a little bit, Father, but I still remain deeply, somebody said good, I still remain deeply sympathetic to the Augustinian approach, and to read Cardinal Ratzinger's works, and then of course his work as Pope, and one of which, a favorite of mine is Spe Salvi, his encyclical letter on hope, where I think he kind of beautifully really sort of sums up the dilemma we find ourselves in, the current dilemma we find ourselves in, which is to live in a world that increasingly, finds God unintelligible, right? And he says there something which I think is absolutely right. I think even Nietzsche knew this, that, without God, man cannot live. And that's the challenge, right? To me, that's one of the challenges that we all face together, and that Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, really devoted his theological life to, was trying to make Christ present to us so we could have a relationship with him. To me, that's the essence of a lot of his writing. But with that, I'll turn this over to Ed Condon, to my right, who will speak, and then we'll continue on and eventually open up to you guys. So thank you.
I should say, for clarity, does the microphone work? Oh, is it this one? Is this? I don't know. Oh, well.
We're good. Can people hear
Great.
Ed? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
okay, fine. Very good. I should say up front, I'm not a theologian. So much of what makes Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, such a towering presence in the life of the church is no more accessible to me than it is to anyone else, or at least to the average Catholic in the pews. I do not have a particularly great theological mind. I studied theology for a while, but I am a canon lawyer by trade, and a journalist by practice now. So my experience of Pope Benedict was somewhat other. But one thing you said, Joe, that I would pick up on and say is definitely true for me is that I think his most immediate and most personal legacy is that he had this deep sense of and love for and desire to communicate having a relationship of love with God, that the immediacy and personal nature of God and his loving relationship for each one of us was central to his thinking, his writing, but also his ministry as a priest, as a bishop, as prefect of the CDF, counterintuitively for anyone who's ever read a secular newspaper about him, but also very much as Pope. His great encyclical Deus Caritas Est. If I had to sum up the thought of Joseph Ratzinger as I've understood it, it is that God is love. That, if Joseph Ratzinger had more to say or to write than that, it was all just unpacking those three words. And that is certainly how I experienced it. A story I've not really told much, except in the last 3 days where it feels like I've been telling it ad nauseum, is how I came to be a canon lawyer, how I came to be a Catholic journalist is effectively Pope Benedict's fault. I was working in British politics in 2010 when he made his state visit to the UK, and he came and gave an address to the joint houses of Parliament, and by happy accident and the boycotting of some particularly grumpy Ulster Scotsmen, I got to sit with my wife pretty much in the 7th row center and listen to him deliver this wonderful address, which I'd encourage you to look up, on conscience and the formation of faith of conscience and the role of conscience in the public space and the role of the church in the dialogue of our public spaces and the relationship between all of these things together. And it was a wonderful occasion, and I really enjoyed the sort of pomp and circumstance of the whole thing. But what it left me with was an abiding sense that I needed to find a new career, that the political process I was involved with, the political party I was working for at the time and everything, was fundamentally irreconcilable with the claims of conscience the church has on me. And that, most importantly, hearing it from Pope Benedict, God was calling me to something better. God was calling me not to live a life of compromise, professional, intellectual, spiritual, or otherwise. And that's what started me down the road to eventually studying canon law, and bizarrely led to Pope Benedict being both the very remote and the very proximate cause for me attending his funeral in Rome last week. And I think, thinking about his legacy, if we want to talk about that, we can talk about Benedict the theologian, we can talk about the things that he wrote, and I think we will be talking about that for a very, very long time. But his real legacy is far more personal. His real legacy is far more immediate. I talked to a lot of people over the course of the few days that I was there, both as they filed in and out of St. Peter's during his lying in state, and then again immediately before and after his funeral in St. Peter's Square. And what struck me was almost no one was there just because a pope had died and it seemed like a thing to go to. A few people were there for that reason, but the vast, vast, vast majority of the people who were there all had a very personal story to tell. Pope Benedict helped me find my vocation. Pope Benedict's writings saved my marriage. Pope Benedict is the one who taught me to love God. Everyone had a personal encounter with this man, even if they never actually spoke directly to him. And I think that's an incredible legacy for anyone to leave, let alone a priest, a bishop, a pope. Thinking about him, not so much just as Joseph Ratzinger, the thinker, the talker, the writer, or even Pope Benedict the theologian, but specifically as Pope Benedict XVI, the governor of the Universal Church for a period of years, he had a number of things that at the time of his resignation accepted, I think a lot of us would have pointed to and said, well, this is his great legacy. It's a fairly self-selecting crowd here at the CIC, so I don't think I need to unpack for you what the words Summorum Pontificum mean, or the significance of them to his legacy as he left office, or the state of that legacy now. Summorum Pontificum has been abrogated. It has been replaced by Pope Francis with Traditionis Custodes in a very different liturgical settlement for the Latin Church. And I don't think that's something anyone would have seen coming at the time of Benedict's resignation, but, and I've argued this before, I think his greatest legacy in office as Pope will have to be considered to be his resignation. And I don't think you can separate logically his resignation from everything that has followed afterwards. Pope Benedict knew what he was doing when he resigned. We know he knew what he was doing when he resigned because he took several weeks after doing it to explain to everyone over and over again, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing this in freedom. I understand what I have done. And if you look over the constitution of the College of Cardinals and the conclave that met to elect his successor, Pope Francis, that conclave only existed for a very brief window in time, could only have existed for a very brief window in time. If Benedict had announced his resignation a few days later or to take effect a week later, there would be prominent cardinals, active cardinals, who were in that conclave and who came out as vocal supporters of Pope Francis and everything that has followed thereafter. People like Benedict's longtime theological sparring partner, Cardinal Walter Casper, who would have been ineligible to attend and to vote. But Benedict made the choice to resign, but he also made the choice to resign when he did, so that the people who elected his successor would be there. And I don't think it's possible to ignore that you can't separate the act of resignation from what I think was a very clear intention, that he was not steering what would follow next. And I've heard different people in Rome and around the church suggest that this was naivete on his part, or he expected differently, and I'm sure he did. I'm sure Pope Benedict had his own thoughts and expectations about who might follow him, but he didn't lift a finger, so far as I can see, to bring that about. And I think that actually shows one of his most important characteristics, which was a total trust, that he didn't necessarily trust the conclave to deliver the result that he would have picked himself, but he trusted that God would look after the church. and that in the end it fundamentally wasn't his responsibility. And I think that is part of his legacy. I think that is something we will be talking about for as long as we remember him. And I think all of that taken together probably plays into what we saw for his funeral last week, which from where I was standing in Rome had a sort of strange feel to it. It wasn't quite fish or fowl. This was the funeral of an important person. It had sort of aspects of papalness to it, but it was not the funeral of a pope who died in office. And, you know, in a sense, it shouldn't have been. You know, he wasn't a pope who died in office. He died in this sort of weird, self-created status of Pope Emeritus. And I don't think anyone quite knew what to make of that, including himself. And I think a lot of what we saw with the funeral, and there's been a lot of debate, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, about whether the church did too much to honor him or not nearly enough to honor his memory and everything. But I think that was kind of, in a sense, inevitable, because that was where he left himself by resigning, as he consigned himself to this weird in-between space. And I think it was a very Benedict move. One of the things I will always remember most about his pontificate is this. He was not John Paul II, and he was not Pope Francis, and he wasn't either of those men in a very particular way. He was not a larger-than-life force of personality on the world stage. He did not, as either his predecessor or I would argue his successor did, make the papacy his own by force of personality. Rather, he, I think, consciously tried to disappear into the office. And that's a very different way of being Pope. It's a way of being Pope that I think the Church was much more used to in previous decades and centuries. And I think Benedict has left an example, whether it turns into a legacy or not, we'll tell with history. But he left an example of a different way of being Pope. And I think that is an example that can be helpful for the Church in the future, particularly if we are, as we seem to be, straying into a Catholic culture that is, defines itself by how do you feel about the current Pope, one way or another, for good or for bad. And to recapture some sense of, well, the office is bigger than the man. And I think that was something that Benedict had a really acute sense of. And I think it's something that there's a lot to learn from.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrea.
It would be ihe.catholic. Thank you, Joseph. And I'm really honored to be at this event with these men that I admire so much and I consider friends. And I'm pretty sure that I've mastered how to say hermeneutics, but I'm not going to focus on that and instead leave that perhaps to Father Aquinas and to Joseph. And instead speak a little bit about what I've seen Benedict's legacy in engaging modernity, particularly in his clarification of issues related to religious freedom. And Professor Brad Lewis, who I don't think is here, but is also part of the Institute for Human Ecology and a professor at Catholic University, and we co-authored an article this weekend in the National Catholic Register about this legacy. And we wrote, "No pope in history has defended religious freedom with such eloquence and authority as Benedict XVI." And I think that everyone that spends some time looking at his work will see that his understanding of this complex issue was clarifying a relationship between religion and freedom in a way that was beautifully laid out in Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom. So just to kind of do a little repass on the Declaration on Religious Freedom, there are a number of concepts that I think are important to constantly remember and reflect upon. First was the Council's belief that God himself has made known to mankind the way in which men are to serve him and thus be saved in Christ and come to blessedness, and that this one true religion subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church, to which the Lord Jesus committed the duty of spreading it abroad among men. The second point that's for all of us to bring to our prayer is that all men are bound to seek the truth, especially in what concerns God and his church, and that it is upon the human conscience that these obligations fall and exert their binding force. And then kind of hitting it out of the park is the third and crucial point, and that's that the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. So we know that while Benedict was just in his 30s, he was a prominent advisor during the council, and throughout his papacy, he affirmed these fundamental principles in the Declaration on Religious Freedom. And two parts in particular of his teaching are worth thinking about now, especially in light of his legacy. And the first is the freedom of the person to believe and worship in accordance with conscience, and the freedom of believers to bring their faith into the public square. And these are indispensable for the church to effectively contribute to culture and political life. So one of my heroes, I'm sure many other people would raise their hand and call her a hero as well, is Harvard law professor Marianne Glendon. People are like, yes, hero. She's done a wonderful job pulling together some of the public messages and addresses of Benedict during his papacy on religious freedom in a chapter that she wrote in a book that was published in 2015 on Benedict's legal thought. It's published by Cambridge University Press. It's a little on the pricey side, but I would highly recommend investing in it. I don't know if it's here. Mitch can inform you afterwards if the Catholic Information Center has it in its stacks. But I want to first point out Benedict's pre-Christmas address to the Roman Curia in 2005. It's well known because of his explanation on Vatican II, where he talks about the hermeneutics of continuity and discontinuity or rupture. And he applied the hermeneutic of reform in the continuity, thank you, precisely to the question of religious liberty, and explained that the general principles taught by the church had not changed, but their applications adapted as a consequence of new and different historical situations. And I found in reading that message, there was something really beautiful. He pointed out and referred to the early Christian martyrs. And he said they, quote, died for their faith in that God who was revealed in Jesus Christ. And for this very reason, they also died for freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess one's own faith, a profession that no state can impose, but which instead can only be claimed with God's grace in freedom of conscience. Benedict's teaching, though, on the value of religious freedom wasn't just limited to the hierarchy, and he wanted to share his understanding with all Catholics and with world leaders. And so when he was here in 2008 on the South Lawn of the White House, he applauded our country's founders for instituting what he called a positive concept of secularism. And the idea behind that, and it's a bit of a head fake, is that the proper relationship between the church and the state is marked by respect towards religion. And we're seeing in our country, and especially with our Supreme Court, that understanding of the founders' intent is coming kind of more clear for people. We're getting out of what people have called a shag carpet understanding of the First Amendment, where the state and the church were hostile to one another, but instead there's this respect for religion. To the US bishops 4 years later on their visit to Rome, Benedict again praised Americans' history of religious freedom and the way we allow religion to influence culture. However, he worried that new policies that were being promoted by kind of a radical and hostile secularism were challenging that. And he implored Catholics, the entire Catholic community in the United States, to come to realize the grave threats to the church's public moral witness presented by a radical secularism, which finds increasing expression in the political and cultural spheres. And if you can kind of do the mental math, you know that this was at the time that the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate was being pushed by the Obama administration, and the Catholic Church was pushing up against that. And individual Catholics and religious groups like the Little Sisters were saying, no, we're not going to budge. One of the other impressive speeches and messages on religious freedom, of course, was when Benedict talked to the General Assembly at the United Nations, again in 2008. And he promoted what I think is a very capacious understanding of religious freedom. It wasn't limited to just the right to worship, but again, that the public dimension of religion and hence the possibility of believers playing their part in building a social order. Kind of curiously, when he finished that message, he was greeted with a standing ovation. Can you imagine world leaders understanding, or at least applauding at the time, the notion that people of faith were going to bring their faith instead of being prevented from living coherently with their faith as citizens? And then finally is the World Day of Peace message in 2018. And he spoke again about this transcendental encounter that we have with God, and that it's a universal good. So that he was speaking to world leaders that it was for the common good to allow for religious freedom, and that he said it's inconceivable that believers should have to suppress a part of themselves, their faith, in order to be active citizens. Now, there's one other thing, and it's maybe a little bit tangential at first sight to the notion of religious freedom, and that is summorum pontificum. And I remember in 2007, July 7th, 2007, when it came out, I wasn't living in the country, and immediate members of my family were being drawn to the traditional Latin Mass, and they were estranged in their relationship with the church. They felt estranged, and they weren't at the time able to celebrate the TLM, and so they were actually estranged from the church. And when the motu proprio came out, after lots of joyful tears on my part, I could see that this was the Holy Father caring for his children and welcoming them back. People who had been separated for years came back. I'm currently living in a diocese that has a lot of people that are participating in the TLM, and many people have come to understand their own relationship with God and grown in their communion through that beautiful celebration of the Mass. And while Ed mentioned things are a little different, I think Benedict's passing gives us the opportunity to reflect on his legacy on this motu proprio and learn from it. It's almost like sometimes you need a second shot to get it right. And we should not only expect that the leaders of our church, but all of us as lay Catholics should be prayerful to learn from what was clearly underlying that, which was a love for the free will that God had given to each one of us to create communion with him and union in the church. So just to kind of wrap it up, Benedict called religious freedom an authentic weapon of peace. And throughout his pontificate, he urged the church and world leaders to wield this weapon for the common good and prayed fervently that all men and women and societies at every level and at every part of the earth soon will be able to experience religious freedom, the path to peace. His prayers weren't answered during his lifetime, but then I don't think he expected them to be. Instead, it's our responsibility to work toward the fulfillment of his vision and his legacy.
Thank you. Father Aquinas?
Thank you. That was lovely.
Good evening, everyone. I've been asked many times since Pope Benedict died on New Year's Eve, what do you think his legacy is or is going to be? And that's the question we're trying to answer this evening. And I have to honestly say, I don't know at this point, because I think his legacy, even though he's not been the successor of Peter for 10 years, I do think his legacy is still working itself out in the church, in the world. I certainly feel his legacy continuing to work itself out in my own life as a priest. And I don't think I'm alone in that, especially priests my age. I was 2 years old when John Paul II was elected the successor of Peter, the Bishop of Rome. When he died, I was already 3 years a priest. So for all that time, my entire life, including 3 years of priesthood, John Paul was the only name I ever heard in the Eucharistic prayer. John Paul was the only name to that point I said in the Eucharistic prayer. And I think for a lot of us, it was just unimaginable that there would ever be another name. It was a little bit inconceivable. He died on April 2nd, 2005. I was assigned to a parish. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was hearing confessions, bawling, crying. I was in a parish that had this electric bell system, so I was trying to get the toller to go. You'd push the button, it'd ring for like 3 minutes and then stop. So, I'm trying to keep that going as I'm trying to hear confessions and trying to process this news that even though we knew, we had watched him decline, for years, it was still, again, inconceivable that someone else, could be Pope. I'm part of the JP2 generation. I'm certainly a JP2 priest and formed in the 90s. And whereas maybe in certain Catholic schools that wasn't maybe the glory days, in terms of the papal magisterium, the 90s were an awesome time. 2 and 3 a year. Encyclicals, apostolic constitutions, major speeches, major policy, motu proprios, major policy decisions were made. And if you're in the seminary at this time, and you've got a concern for orthodoxy, you've got a concern for clarity, if you just have a concern for truth, JP2 is your champion, and certainly a lodestar. I mean, he was your teacher, in terms of your own formation to the priesthood. And so myself, certainly my own confreres in all the seminaries I attended, looked to him, for that. So there was a bit of not just anticipation, but trepidation, maybe, looking ahead to the conclave in 2005. Didn't know exactly what was going to happen. When Joseph Ratzinger came out on the loggia, I think there was certainly a sigh of relief, because you knew that here was the man who stood behind and supported JP2 in his entire pontificate, to be a champion of truth, to be a champion of clarity in orthodoxy. And I think the supposition was we were just going to get JP2 2 or 2.0 in terms of a Ratzinger or a Benedict papacy. But that's not what happened, I don't think, and I think that's been hinted at already. That's not what happened. I think Benedict's papacy, as short as it was, just 8 years compared to JP2's 27 or 28, actually was brought it, in a sense, to perfection or completion. Because Benedict in himself and in the way he exercised his pontificate helped us to see, especially of the JP2 generation, that the clarity in orthodoxy, clarity in truth is not an end in itself, but rather just the beginning of what Benedict helped us to see is a life of worship and a life of prayer. And I should say a life of worship and a life of charity. That's the crowning of orthodoxy. That's the crowning of any individual's grasp and command of truth, Christian truth. It's not enough simply to assent to and to understand the articles of faith, but that has to reduce in life to worship of the true God and a life of charity, being aflame in love for God and for neighbor, informed by the truth revealed to us in Jesus Christ. It's a life of worship and charity in friendship with Christ, who is truth. I think it was a crucial lesson for the JP2 generation. I think it saved a lot of priesthoods. I think it saved a lot of men in the priesthood by helping them to deepen their appreciation of the great gift of ordination that they've received. I think it changed the way they approach the sacraments. I think Benedict's pontificate helped to change the way they approach study by seeing its fruitfulness born in a life of worship and a life of charity. And Benedict certainly modeled that himself, probably the smartest man on earth, from a certain perspective. And yet, I think what drew people to Rome during his pontificate to see him was to listen to him, but know that what they heard from him was the fruit of great love, born of worship, that's informed by study. I'd heard it said early in the Benedict pontificate, because surprisingly the numbers at the Wednesday audiences increased. They didn't decrease. I think people expected them. The mousy German professor was going to scare people away from in comparison to the rock star JP2 audiences. That didn't happen. The numbers increased steadily in the early Benedict years. And someone summed that up for me. Actually, it was people in Rome. They said, people went to Rome to see John Paul. They went to Rome to hear Benedict, which is something different and encouraging, actually, just when you reflect on the state of the world. But I think that was true for, again, priest of my generation. John Paul gave us a lot, and a lot to get excited about, a lot that sustained us in formation. But Benedict helped us to see, what all of that clarity, orthodoxy, enthusiasm is for, if not for leading oneself, but also the people of God in true worship, which is itself the source and fountain of a life of charity. So that's in terms of reflecting on the legacy of Benedict, just reflecting on it, continuing to unfold in my own life as a priest. That's what I appreciate.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a lot out there, and there's more than, of course, even we touched on. And so I invite you to just raise your hand, and I will point to you and say, please ask your question. We do have a microphone. It looks like that will go around to you. So wait until you receive the microphone, and like I said, also ask a question, and if you can, also direct it to somebody. If you want to direct it to somebody, that's of course helpful as well. So why don't we start right here in the front?
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. A quick question for each of you, whoever chooses to answer this. Just kind of two parts, basically. Who do you think Pope Benedict would have selected as his replacement? The second question is, if you are a voting member of the Sacred College of Cardinals, who would you select as Francis's replacement? Short answers are fine.
Yeah, this is an easy question for me. I don't know, and I don't know.
I think the answer to the first part is reasonably well known. Most people who were close to Pope Benedict's thinking at the time agree that he expected that it would be Cardinal Angelo Scola who would have been elected. Obviously, he wasn't. As for the second part of your question, I have no idea. I don't know nearly enough of the cardinals nearly well enough to make an informed estimation of who would be best.
Yeah, I don't know. Not touching that. No. I mean, thank you, because the second one I can say I'm not eligible. But thank you.
Yeah, that was the same question I asked George Weigel a couple of years ago, and he sort of refused to answer. I was thinking his answer might have affected his book sales, but anyway. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in.
A lot of people. I was not a fan of the resignation at the time, so I probably wasn't reflecting on, I don't know. Should popes reflect on who they would pick? Maybe not. I made the prediction that as punishment might be too strong a word, but let's just say punishment for his own resignation, that he would outlive his successor. He almost did. We'll see. But he lived a long time. He lived a whole lot longer than he expected to. Just in terms of
Did you break some
2
news
years?
right there?
No.
How do you know?
I don't. Yeah, I could have said that a little differently. No, I mean, people do say that he was concerned about his health. Maybe that was one of the contributing factors, to his decision to resign, especially maybe after seeing John Paul II decline as he did, whether that limited his capacity to really exercise the office, at least maybe in the way that Benedict thought it needed to in his day, and whether he was in the same situation, whether he'd be able to do that. That would terrify me. God obviously had other plans, to be the retired pope for 2 years longer than you were the actual pope. I certainly don't think was in his planning or thinking. So whatever he thought about his successor or whatever, again, providence seems to have its own designs.
Okay, other questions? I'm going to sort of slowly work us back. I don't want you to be running up and down the aisle. So I see you in the back, but we're going to get you in a couple of minutes, okay? I won't forget you. Yes.
Thank you. This is a question that you kind of touched on earlier with the the school of Augustine versus the school of Aquinas.
Not versus. Versus.
But I find it so interesting. I love Benedict, but most people see him as this kind of abstract, esoteric scholar.
Yeah.
But his writings are so personal and so humanly profound. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the school of thought, either that he comes from or that he leaves us.
Yeah, probably not well. Briefly, right? To be honest, there's a lot of different things that are informing his thinking. One of them would be sort of the German Kantian philosophic tradition, right? I mean, you can see aspects of that in his thought. I think, as I said earlier, also, I find him deeply Augustinian in all the good ways. Like you, I don't find his thought at all abstract. In fact, I find Pope John Paul II's writings more difficult to engage than I do find Pope Benedict's or Cardinal Ratzinger's. What I see in them, again, also belies the misinterpretation or misunderstanding of Pope Benedict. A lot of curiosity and humility with regard to the questions that we face. So I think he's sort of unique in his engagement with a tradition of thinking from a kind of Germanic perspective. So it's good to compare him to Rahner, of course, who he was close to, right? He was intellectually in some ways very close to, and also personally, as a young man, very, very close to, and Casper and that German tradition that is also informed by its experience, right? You can't help but think that a lot of the he's kind of profoundly liberal in some respects, politically, right? By comparison to other thinkers in ways that are almost idiosyncratic, right? You wouldn't think of this person, who has this reputation for being dogmatic and so on, to be in fact a questioner, who's open to things and who's open to drawing on the depth of the tradition and wants the tradition to continue to speak to us. That to me is the legacy. He's not merely Augustinian, or he's not merely Thomistic or something like that, right? Or merely even Kantian. I saw somebody say, look, he just, he sounds very Kantian. He's a lot like Habermas. And it's like, well, I don't think that it really does, is fair to him. To me, he's exactly the kind of thinker that our church ought to produce. The people who are really rooting around in this tradition, provoked by the questions that the tradition has been engaged with for centuries, in the context, that they're occupying. And that's what he does and invites us all to do. I mean, the one thing I was always struck by, even in, the time or two I met him very, very briefly, was, again, this kind of retiring humility. Like, it was just, he wants to hear you or hear the people he's engaged with. It wasn't, I never got this sense of arrogance, which I've heard us also attributed to him intellectually, that in fact he's what our tradition forms when it informs our best thinkers. Somebody who's trying to understand what God is speaking to us right now by virtue of, really deeply engaging and being formed by the tradition that he, considers himself a part of. So I don't think there's going to be a school. I think there's going to be a mode, right? Or like a kind of disposition, I guess, to answer your question. Yeah. David.
Joe, following up on
Yes.
your comment about the surprising ways in which he exhibited a liberal tendency, I'm reminded of his encyclical on charity and his discussion on the environment. He was
a good green.
He was denominated the first green pope.
Correct. Right.
It's a surprising area of continuity between his pontificate and Francis's, and I'm wondering if the panel sees other surprising areas of continuity between those two pontificates.
Look, I think the first, actually, Ed already mentioned, which was, to me, both of these pontificates are like Pope John Paul II, emphasizing the missiological aspect of the church. We are a church on mission, right? And the mission is to bring people into encounter with Christ, right? And obviously they're doing it in very different ways, but Benedict is not going to impress with charisma, right? He's not doing it in that way. It is, and I think this perhaps is a point that Father made, it is by reintegrating the intellectual life with the spiritual life, right? I mean, I think to some extent that's precisely what he's doing in the way of like completing the legacy of Pope John Paul II. And I don't mean to by any means suggest that Pope John Paul II had them disintegrated, but that's to me what he was, really trying to do, was bring people into an encounter with Christ and Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the 3 volumes are about, right? In the world as he diagnosed it, right? A world that was severely damaged by lack of confidence in truth, right? A waning hopefulness, right? I mean, this is why Spe Salvi is so important to understanding it, right? That people are hoping less and less. So that's how I would begin to answer that excellent question, David.
I'd also add to that, when you think of Benedict, you don't think of his role as in his pastoral care right away, but you should. And Ed maybe can speak to one of the other motu proprios, reaching out to Anglicans and the legacy that we are still enjoying and delighting in the creation of, like, the Ordinariate. There's something very similar that Pope Francis has been doing in trying to reach out to people, that the church is not closing her doors, but trying to open them to bring people into communion and union with the Holy See and kind of a plenitude of truth. And that has been bearing incredible fruits in people since those two motu proprios came out. I think we all know people who have been transformed by that outreach.
I think that's right. I'd be slightly terrified of discussing the full import of Anglicorum Cedibus, just because of some of the people in this room who know it much better than I. But I do think you're right that is part of Benedict's essential nature as Pope, which was a church that was very much outward facing, a church that was very much in constant dialogue, but it wasn't dialogue for the sake of talking. It was dialogue for the sake of forging real communion. And I think that is something that you can see carried on in aspects of Pope Francis's continuation. One of the other things I think we have to mention, because I mean, again, there's a pope is several things. A pope is a teacher, a pope is a priest, a pope is also a governor. One of the great continuities, I would say, one of the great escalations between the two popes is, we tend to forget that Benedict didn't resign sort of, on a quiet summer's afternoon when there was nothing going on. It was a time of particular scandal for the church, and particularly scandal in the Vatican, that we'd had a series of financial and moral and all sorts of other hideous things hitting not just the newspapers around Rome, but also the courtrooms of the Vatican. You know, Benedict XVI died with many, many friends. He also left a papal butler who ended up in prison and I think died in jail for his part in stealing his secret papers and putting them around to unscrupulous journalists, not like me. I hasten to add. But I think one of the great things that we should remember about the moment of Benedict's resignation is it was widely understood when his successor came out of the loggia that this man will possess a mandate for reform, practical curial reform, an end to corruption. And Pope Francis did things that, frankly, Pope Benedict could not. That, you know, we sadly have to mourn today the passing of Cardinal George Pell, who, let us not forget, became a world figure, not just a senior churchman in Australia, became really a world figure because he was the man who Pope Francis turned to and said, all right, clean this mess up. And he made some very important, very great strides in that. And the tide of that curial reform under Pope Francis has, I think, ebbed and flowed considerably over the last decade. But again, you know, if we're looking for points of continuity between the two pontificates, I think you have to look at curial reform as one of those.
Great. Other questions? Let's start moving back because I don't want to make the man in the back, you know, anxious that we will never get to him. Right, we'll go to this side of the room for a change. Yep.
Thank you. The question about how to situate Benedict in schools of thought kept the light bulbs off. And I see what you're getting at, Joe. But I don't suggest to put it in a European context. I mean, it doesn't quite fit what we normally consider liberalism, and it's probably closer to an Augustinian approach. But the milieu that he also shared with Jean-Paul of the personalism of the 1930s and the Church of Phenomenology, both which then flourished much in the 50s as well. As you know, John Paul carried that on, and our own David Walsh on personalism that continues today, in that it is such an emphasis on the particularity, the dignity of each person, and this Christology is essentially a phenomenological counter with the love of God by each person subjectively and intensively. So I think that might help situate.
Thank you. Another question? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed you. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, you were. I did see you earlier. Yeah.
So, I heard a term. Are you Mr. or Dr. Compton?
I do have a doctorate in canon law.
Mr. Doctor.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Doctor will be fine.
Okay. So, when Mr. Doctor was speaking, I heard him use the word dialogue, and dialogue is a word that we can often hear, especially in sort of matters of church engaging with the world, but it's not always clear what that means, at least to me. But in the very brief amount of works of when he was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger that I've read, dialogue seemed to be a recurring theme, and if I recall correctly, he even described God's relationship with humanity as a dialogue. So I was just, I guess I don't really quite have a question, but, sure. What do you think Pope Benedict's understanding of dialogue is, and the seeming centrality he gives it in Christian life? Sorry for the easy one.
We all have to follow.
Do you want to take a swipe at it?
I mean, I think what Ed said earlier, it rang true to me that yes, and maybe this is a kind of Thomistic aspect of Ratzinger's Augustinianism, is that one does arrive at the truth in terms of real conversation, real dialogue, real exploration of questions and possibilities within a conversation, within a community, common reflection on authoritative texts, and arriving at conclusions and the responses to objections that becomes the mode by which we arrive at deeper understandings of what has been revealed to us. Yeah, I think that's what dialogue should be. I mean, it's a kind of a common reflection on the articles of faith that lead to deeper understandings and applicability to our contemporary circumstances. One of my favorite, Space Salvi's been mentioned several times. I mean, one of my favorite parts there is, I think it's towards the beginning, it's either the 4th or the 7th paragraph, where Pope Benedict engages Luther's error on hope, which is rooted in a fundamental mistake about faith. And who does Pope Benedict rely on to provide kind of the key response to the problem? But Aquinas. So Aquinas was a premier commentator on Augustine, so it's not a surprise here. But so I think it's in friendship with others. It's friendship with curious minds reflecting on the same thing, and the back and forth of conversation within friendship, common love. I mean, we just celebrated the feast of Basil and Gregory, a few days ago. I mean, this is, when you read the Office of Readings and Basil's description of his friendship. I mean, this is it. I mean, it's to share life together in a common pursuit of truth. Which again is not the end, but the means, to the end.
And even there, I think when he mentions Luther, it's not in some sort of dismissive, careless way.
It's like, this is a smart.
This is a smart person,
right,
who the Pope assumes is trying to figure out the truth, right? And I think that what Father said is absolutely right. Like, if you look at the Regensburg Address, right? The notorious Regensburg Address, which to my mind is precisely engaged in this endeavor of esteeming reason as a means for pursuing truth. And also, of course, then arguing reason is not merely some instrument, right, for like practical analysis, or what might be even more despairing, something that no longer ought to be functioning in our lives, right? He's trying to, to my mind, one of the things he's always doing is trying to re-esteem reason as a capacity that human beings have to engage in the pursuit of true things. And you take people at their word that what they're saying is a truth claim that now you esteem by engaging it as such. And that's what I think he does in that address. And I think he's doing that precisely with Luther at that point. It's a great question. So why don't we go back and get him so I can stop talking about it. The gentleman in the way back.
Thank you very much, and may I say that the entire panel was both uplifting and very intellectually stimulating. Joseph and Andrea spoke of Sonorum Pontificum and the impact that it had as a document and what it meant to Catholics. Of course, what happened July 15th, day of infamy, set back Benedict's vision and his contribution. My question is obvious. Do you see the next Pope restoring it and abrogating Traditionis Custodes? By the way, Cardinal Pell, who died tonight at 81, was also a strong believer in Sonorum Pontificum and never felt that many bishops would actually take advantage of changing the status quo with it. And most have left it as it has, but it still makes it more difficult to have new TLMs. What do you think will happen?
I don't think you meant to direct that to me.
Yes, he did.
No, that's not my area of specialization. So Ed or somebody else who would like to speak to that. I don't predict things. I like to study things that already happened. It's safer.
I don't think that it's useful to try and predict what the next pope may or may not do when we don't know when the next pope will be, and even less do we know who he will be. What I will say is this: I think that the abrogation of Summorum Pontificum and the promulgation of Traditionis Custodes show two alternative diagnoses of the liturgical and theological life in parts of the church. Summorum Pontificum, I think, very much reflected Benedict, at least as I've understood it, Benedict's own understanding of liturgy, of divine worship, and of theology. And, Andrea was speaking earlier about the hermeneutic of continuity with the Second Vatican Council, that it was possible to have something like Summorum Pontificum in Benedict's mind because there's no disharmony between what came before and what has come afterwards. Now, reading Traditionis Custodes, Pope Francis has diagnosed the situation rather differently, in which he has said fairly clearly that there are those who both have an attachment to the older forms of the liturgical rites and at the same time, in the mind of the Pope, practice in effect a hermeneutic of rupture. Now, I think it's open for debate how widespread and how true that is amongst communities that favor the older rite of the Mass, but nevertheless, that is the thinking of Pope Francis. So I think it is safe to assume that people are not going to stop caring about liturgy between now and the next Pope, whenever that may be. At least I certainly hope they won't stop caring about liturgy. And I think that we will see an ongoing conversation around these issues. And I think what we have always needed in the Church, and I think we needed this immediately following the Second Vatican Council and didn't get it in quite a lot of places, is that where there is liturgical change, where there is change in how we pray as a people, there needs to be accompanied by this catechesis. The people who understand why a change takes place, what it is we are doing and why. And I think until we arrive at a truly settled understanding of the Second Vatican Council amongst the entire Church, if such a thing is possible, we will continue to have conversations about liturgy and what the liturgy means. If we say lex orandi, lex credendi, we have to make sure we all believe the same thing in order to be able to say that it doesn't matter which way we choose to pray. And I don't know that we are there yet.
Mm-hmm. No, and I would just add one thing I would highly recommend reading The Pillar because
I would too.
The Pillar. No, last night I was reading an article and one of the authors in The Pillar wrote about Benedict's legacy of what he called liturgical pluralism. And it wasn't just limited to Summorum Pontificum, but it also dealt with the placement of the cross on the altar. There are lots of things that I think we can learn as Catholics today and pass on to our children about the richness of this beautiful liturgy that we have and the relationship that we can grow and strengthen through it with God, and that it's always going to be a great temptation to get in the way of that we can get in the way of that through division, disunity. And we kind of need to keep our eyes on the prize, right, which is heaven, and follow the lead, especially the lead in this legacy that Benedict laid out there, where we're studying, we're contemplating, we're praying, and we're trying to not ever promote any kind of disunity in the Church. And that's, quite a big task, but one that I think, you're made for these times. So for as difficult as it may seem, God chose to put all of us in this time and in the Church as it is, and we need to carry on what we can to make sure that the Church, we all become one in Christ instead of scattered.
Okay, how about one more question? I see a hand also in the way back. Oh, okay, there you go. I didn't see you at all. I'm glad the microphone found you.
Thank you to all the speakers. My question concerns the Great Abdication in 2013. As, of course, Pope Gregory XII and the Great Western Schism went back to being a cardinal when he abdicated. Pope St. Celestine V went back to being a monk. Why did Pope Benedict XVI, at the time of his abdication, choose to become a Pope Emeritus? And to any of the speakers who have knowledge on this also, what role did he see himself as having, perhaps in the office of the papacy still, as a Pope Emeritus at the time when he made that decision? How did it work out, or not really at all?
That's you, right?
Common consensus seems to be the lawyer has to take this one. All right.
The canon lawyer.
Yeah.
The canon lawyer.
Why did he choose to be known as Pope Emeritus? I do not know. I have no special understanding of that. I mean, he's also consistently reported to have desired to be addressed as Father Benedict after his abdication. Why we ended up with this status of a Pope Emeritus instead of other titles that I would personally find more appealing and legally easier to understand, like Bishop Emeritus of Rome, for example. I do not know. I part of me wonders if Benedict himself didn't expect that it may not matter all that much how he chose to be addressed or dress himself or anything else in his retirement. One, because he didn't think it would go on that long, I would assume. And two, because he thought, well, there will be another pope and I'll do what he tells me. And if he wants me to be called this or wear that, I will. And in the end, Francis seems to have been very respectful of what Benedict chose for himself and just left him to it. And I wonder if there wasn't also an element of sort of constant expected experimentation about the whole thing, that both Benedict and Francis and everyone around them in the Curia were just kind of seeing how things worked out. You know, we had never done this before in any meaningful way, certainly not in the modern era. And so there was an aspect of, well, we're just sort of feeling our way here. The question was also, you know, what role did he see himself having in the papacy after his resignation? I can't claim to know his mind, but I would sincerely hope he saw himself as having no role in the papacy whatsoever, because you can't have two popes. And some sort of poetical allusions to this that I've read in the past notwithstanding, there is no expanded Petrine ministry with a Pope Emeritus. There is one Bishop of Rome at a time, and his name is Francis, and it has been for the last 10 years. Benedict was, I'm sure, a welcome institutional memory and a reassuring presence, and someone that Francis did go and see. And he did occasionally make public statements or offer public writings. For example, he wrote a long letter in 2019, shortly ahead of Pope Francis's global summit of bishops to answer the Episcopal confidence crisis triggered by the McCarrick scandal and the situation in Chile at the time, and things like that. And that was praised by Pope Francis as a welcome and helpful contribution, as was the famous book on which Benedict's name originally appeared, In Defense of Clerical Celibacy, a book that generated quite a lot of negative pushback against the Pope Emeritus, but nevertheless seemed to capture, at least as far as I can see, Pope Francis's feelings on the subject as well.
I was going to say, if there is canonical or juridical, jurisdictional messiness around the question, maybe one area of greater clarity that's come to the fore is maybe just a moral appreciation of the identity of someone who becomes Peter, that it's not just a bishopric that you can take up and put aside, but I mean, to become the Bishop of Rome is something that endures even if you canonically, juridically cease to exercise it. So maybe that.
But it doesn't impart a character.
No, that's right. So that's right. But there's something about just the moral identity of one becoming Peter. That this one bishop does stand out, among all the others. And I don't know, at the running the risk of saying too much about the office of the Pope, and maybe it stretches the unity that should be there between identity and mission. But I think there is something where I think we can appreciate an enduring identity even if the mission is set aside. And maybe that's what he was could be. It was maybe something that he was experimenting too. I think folks would just found it strange if he would have just kind of returned to Bavaria and started teaching again. I mean, that would have been maybe some people were hoping for that, but I think people would have found
the Bavarians
found it odd, just in terms of who we understand the Pope to be and at least the identity and mission he's taken up in the world today. So I can appreciate this, staying in the Vatican. Maybe part of the answer too is what Pope Francis is. He's been pretty on message as to what Benedict's mission has been in the Church. Has been kind of a quiet father behind the scenes in supporting the life of the Church with his prayer, so that might be part of the answer too. That Francis has made he's had his own contribution to make here in terms of figuring out who or what a Pope Emeritus is for the Church.
Well, that's great. I guess it's a good place to end in a sense because it points to how open-ended the legacy really is here. We'll see what happens with Pope Francis. So again, thank you all very, very much for joining us this evening. Thanks to Mitch and the staff at the CIC for putting this all together. This is one of their first events, maybe one of your first events in the newly renovated center. I think it looks fantastic. I'm sure you guys agree. There is a reception. Oh, excuse, I will not steal anyone's thunder. Again, thank you very much for coming.
As he was saying, there will be a reception until 8 o'clock p.m., so we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.